On a summer evening, Daniel, a freshman in high school, has his long-awaited summer vacation. After entering high school, Daniel is under heavy academic pressure to play piano at home every night. And the only time he gets to relax a little is the time between dinner and bedtime. But that also meant that he missed out on playing with the neighborhood kids. Every time Daniel goes downstairs, he feels alone and isolated. There is a swing in the garden downstairs, and that is where Daniel must go every day. Sitting on the swing, he could swing freely and get a rare moment of relaxation. However, one evening when Daniel came out into the garden, he found that someone was already on the swing. It was a teenage girl in a ponytail who was swinging with gusto, laughing in an unusually strange way, as if she had a blockage in her throat, her voice eerie and low, like a sound you would hear underwater. The little girl mumbled something as she laughed, her voice muffled. As Daniel approached, he heard the clear words,
"Harder, harder, push me, push me."
The little girl shouted excitedly as the swing increased in amplitude, her pale little legs swaying along with it. She suddenly turned her head and stared at Daniel, her eyes cold and unfeeling. The corners of her mouth stiffened with an eerie smile. Daniel was stunned by her face and stood still, not knowing what to do. The little girl suddenly turned back and continued to play on the swing. Daniel looked at her back and felt a chill come over him. Suddenly, he realized that his surroundings were dark. There was no one in the garden, and the windows of the buildings across the street were all extinguished. The windows of the buildings on the other side of the street were all extinguished, but a few pale figures were visible inside the windows. This sudden sight made Daniel feel uneasy, and he quickly turned and rushed into the dark hallway. But even though the tapping sound triggered the sound-activated light to turn on the mechanism, the light was unresponsive at this time. Daniel crawled to the third floor in the dark and hurriedly knocked on the door of his house. At the same time, the sound of footsteps came from the hallway, getting closer and closer, and the sound-activated light suddenly flashed. The person standing on the stairs was the same young girl he had seen in the garden earlier, her back to Daniel, slowly backing up, but her footsteps were getting faster and faster. Daniel called out loudly, but when the door was finally opened, it was his mother who appeared, disgruntled, chiding him.
"What's the hurry? The door is going to be knocked down."
Daniel didn't have a chance to answer back and hurried into the house. Daniel didn't have time to reply, but hurried into the house. However, the little girl on the stairs stopped there, trembling with her head down, and her strange laughter echoed through the narrow hallway. As Daniel lay in bed late at night, he tossed and turned and had trouble sleeping. He felt as if there was something behind his back that made him uncomfortable, and his shoulders felt sore. Finally, in the wee hours of the morning, he felt sleepiness come over him and closed his eyes. Suddenly, he felt himself being pushed hard, and his upper body jerked up before he fell heavily back into bed. The sleepiness vanished in an instant, and he sat up in horror, staring at the bed. The curtains were ghastly white with moonlight, and there was a crunching sound coming from the window, and Daniel suddenly saw a thin silhouette projected on the curtains, followed by the sound of tapping on the glass with a specific rhythm that seemed to convey some kind of message. Along with the sound, the silhouette zooms in and out of the window, while the curtains continue to shake. Daniel carefully pulls back the curtains to find a pair of feet hanging from the windowsill, constantly banging against the glass. Daniel slowly peers upwards, and what he sees is the little girl in the red dress, strangled by a rope around her neck, her head swollen, a creepy purple color, and looking about to dripping blood. Great fear filled Daniel. He couldn't make a sound. His body stiffened, and his hands involuntarily loosened the curtains. A numbing cackle continued to sound. It was the sound of the rope rubbing against the skin around his neck, At that moment, the little girl hanging out of the window was also slowly letting go until her shadow was completely reflected on the curtains.
Push me, push me.
The girl's voice sounded again, and Daniel realized why her laughter was so eerie, because her throat was strangled. The figure outside the window kept swinging her legs, and the glass kept being tapped. Daniel finally came to his senses and immediately turned to run out of his bedroom. But just as he turned his head, he saw a pair of feet dangling in front of his eyes. The sound of the rope rubbing against his neck was getting closer and closer above Daniel's head, but he didn't dare to look up. Above him, the feet slowly descended and stepped on Danny's shoulders. A cold, stabbing pain traveled through his body. He wanted to scream but couldn't make a sound.
Brother, come play on the swing with me.
The girl's hand suddenly snaps around Daniel's neck and pulls upwards. Daniel's throat is strangled and he tries to scream, but can't make a sound. Finally, his vision blurred and he finally passed out. A few days later, Daniel woke up and came downstairs again to find that the swing in the garden had been removed. At this moment, he realized that a girl had once hanged on that swing, and she was wearing a red dress when she died. Since then, Daniel never encountered strange things again, but his back became hunched because he kept a pair of feet on his shoulders. I remember that time when I was still young. Our family was situated next to a parking lot in a suburb filled with all kinds of buses, among which bus number 13 was the busiest because it went straight to the city center. That day, I was standing outside my house, bored, playing with my cell phone, when a beggar suddenly appeared, ragged and limping, and pitifully asked if I could give him some food. Driven by an impulse of kindness, I took out some leftover food from my home and gave it to him. However, to my surprise, he did not leave in a hurry after eating.
Little friend, you don't look well, so you should be more careful these days.
I smiled coyly. I wasn't good at talking to strangers at that time. Before he left, he gave me a small pendant, which was made of an unrecognizable material, but it was cool to the touch and was especially comfortable to wear on that hot summer day. At night, my family went to a friend's party and they usually didn't come back early. I was home alone, watching TV, but as it was nearing 11 o'clock and I was about to go to sleep, I got a call from my mom. She told me that my father had gotten into an argument with someone and that he had been injured and was currently being treated at a hospital in the city center, and asked me to come as soon as possible. In a moment of panic, I grabbed my jacket, rushed out of the house, and ran to the bus stop to wait for the vehicle to arrive. Even though it was already July, the late-night wind still carried a hint of coolness. I stood on the side of the road and watched a bus go by, but the 13 never showed up. As I waited anxiously, the No. 13 bus suddenly appeared. Under the night sky, the bus on Route 13 slowly drove by. However, it looked very old and rickety, almost like a black coffin. Nonetheless, without thinking too much about it, I answered the phone and got on the bus. But at that moment, no one noticed that the pendant on my chest gave off a faint glow. Sitting in the car, I casually scanned the other passengers and lines in the car, but I felt a sense of strangeness. How could there be so many people this late at night? The car was almost full, but all the people seemed to maintain a deathly silence. As I looked around, I could only feel that the car was a bit worn out, and it swayed in the wind as if it might be blown away by the wind at any moment. Gradually, I felt tired and could not help closing my eyes. Shortly afterward, I awoke from my dream with a thought flashing through my mind. This bus should not exist. I remember 2 years ago, The 13 bus had a serious accident. The car suddenly caught fire. The fire spread rapidly. The driver left the passengers, even without opening the door to flee the scene, resulting in more than a dozen people in the car all died. The incident shocked the entire city and made headlines. I began to feel something was wrong. A sense of loss came over me, as if something important had been lost. Suddenly, I noticed that the cab was empty, and I recalled that I didn't seem to see the driver when I got on the bus. I couldn't help but shudder, and then flames erupted from nowhere inside the compartment. The fire spread rapidly, but confusingly, everyone else seemed unperturbed, sitting motionless in their seats as if completely unaware of the fire. Only I, like an ant scalded by fire, desperately tried to escape. The compartment was filled with a cacophony of voices. The sounds of arguing and fighting continued, and a bizarre scene played out before my eyes. Passengers scrambled for the doors. Some old men were trampled. Women tried their best to protect the babies in their arms. Some fought to escape the flames, and some even fell at my feet. However, I remained rigidly still, watching it all with fear. Gradually, the cacophony grew louder and louder, and the sounds of quarreling and fighting continued until I fell into a stupor. That noise seemed to go on and on in my ears, but before I lost consciousness, I seemed to see the fire-scorched figures slowly coming toward me. When I woke up the next day, it was 3 days later. I was lying in a hospital bed next to my mother, who told me that I had been unconscious for 3 whole days and nights when I was found on the number 13 bus. I don't know what happened next, except that the little locket the beggar had given me was broken. Although I had looked around for that filthy beggar, he seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The incident ended with nothing,